Okay, so this is the fourth and final lecture for the chapter on social stratification and social class. In this video, we're going to talk about the definition of poverty and how it was originally calculated, and then we're going to apply the three sociological theories: conflict, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism, to the concept of social stratification. The thing I want you to remember most, well, the thing that's going to show up on your quiz and your final exam is the poverty line is based on what? And the answer to that question is the price of food. Back in 1964, under President Johnson, this is during right around the Vietnam War, his administration established a federal guideline that said that people who earn a certain amount below this threshold would be considered officially poor. And that's where we come with this definition of the poverty line. And then each year, this calculation is adjusted to the price of food. As the price of food goes up, then the poverty line is readjusted. You'll notice in your handout, I have the 2016 federal guidelines for the 48 contiguous states, right? The poverty line is the official threshold is the same. For Hawaii and Alaska, it's slightly different. Why there's not more variation in the 48 states, I can't say, because certainly we know that the price of food in Kansas is different than probably the price of food in California. But it's established in 1964 and it's considered highly not controversial, but really out of date, because it takes the diet. It's called the emergency food budget. It takes the diet of what people ate in the 1950s. It applied it to 1962 prices, and then it's the same food. So it assumes that people are eating, or it's based on the assumption that people in 2020 are eating the same food that they would have eaten in 1952. So it would have been things like very basics, flour, salt, sugar, not microwave meals, and the kind of food that we eat today. So it's really out of date. But it also is based on the assumption that in the 1960s, people spent a third, right? The assumption is that that your income was spent on three basic things. Food was one third, housing was one third, and then everything else was a third. Well, you fast forward to the 2020s, and people's budgets are way more complicated than this. And today we only spend about a fifth of our budget on food. So what would happen if we would recalculate the food budget, and this dollar amount for food would be multiplied times 5 instead of multiplied times 3, is overnight a whole bunch more people would be considered poor if we adjusted the way this official calculation of who is poor. And nobody wants to do that. Republicans don't want to do that. Democrats don't want to do that. So we continue to use this very outdated calculation. The key is price of food, right? Established based on the price of food. And it assumes that you spend a third of your income on food, when we actually don't. We have all these expenses today that we didn't have in 1964. And then, of course, it's adjusted based on the number of people. I often like to show that calculation to people to see if they if they consider themselves to be they would be considered officially poor. Many organizations like WIC and public housing use a percentage. So they might use 200% of the poverty line, which would be twice this, or twice whatever the guideline is, because again, it's so outdated. An important thing to also point out here is who is poor. I'm likely to ask you this question as well. If I were to put all of America's poor people in one room, and then I'm going to divide them up by gender, I'm going to find there's way more women. Women are more likely to be poor than men. And this is what's referred to as the feminization of poverty. Poverty is much more a feminine problem for women and their children than it is men. The images that you see in the media of homeless guys sitting in the park, that is not the typical poor person in the United States. The typical poor person is a rural woman and her children. When you watch the video assignment Tammy story, Tammy is the most common version of poverty in the United States. It is not the homeless black man living in the city. It is the poor woman, rural white woman living in the country with her kids in her trailer and no heater. Okay, so we have then different ways. So we were together, I might ask you, why do you think people are poor? And there, fundamentally, we would come up with two sort of camps. One camp would say that people are poor, and certainly there's some truth to this, that people are poor because there's something that about them that makes it difficult or impossible for them to access the resources. For them, they're lazy or alcoholics or ill or uneducated, and therefore they're poor because of some personal way of being. This is the individual level explanation, right? This says that poverty is a personal problem, and that if you want to escape poverty, you need to do something individually. As we've said from the very beginning, sociology is not about the personal, it's about the structural and the societal. The other explanation is the structural explanation of poverty, and that says that people are poor not because of something they have done, but because of where they're at in the structure, right? That you could be the hardest working, the most intelligent, the most capable individual, but if you are living at a place in the triangle and there's no jobs, you can't work, right? I mean, if the structure does not have places for you to use your skills, then, so for instance, what's just recently happened is many people have been laid off. Like a record number of people have been laid off in the last 4 weeks. And it's not because these folk, well, I would ask you, why did they all get laid off? Not because they're all lazy, but because all of a sudden the businesses closed their doors, and the structure has changed, and people's social class has changed when the structure changed. And this is a critical thing to understand, is, or from a sociological perspective, is that, yeah, there's a certain number of people who maybe made bad choices, but that's not the case for most people. For most people, they're in a place where they're unable to access the resources. And yeah, we could argue that maybe they could move, but right now there's not really any place to move to, right? So we talk about the structural versus the individual explanations. Okay. The next topic are the three theoretical explanations: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. I'm going to have to do that in the next 10 minutes because I don't want these files to get too long and then me not to be able to upload them. So I'm going to stop here and make one more that have the theories.